Okay, welcome to this A-level Buddhism video by Karen Armstrong. This is her book, The Buddha, and the Buddha's Enlightenment, Chapter 3, and this is anthology work for A-level Buddhism. So let's read it and then we'll take it apart. If there's any truth to the story that Gautama gained enlightenment at Bodh Gaya in a single night, it could be that he acquired a sudden absolute certainty that he had discovered a method that would, if followed energetically, bring an earnest seeker to Nibbana. He'd not made this up. It was not a new creation or an invention of his own. On the contrary, he always insisted that he had simply discovered a path of great antiquity, an ancient trail travelled by human beings in a far-off distant era. The other Buddhas in his predecessors had taught the path an immeasurably long time ago, but this ancient knowledge had faded over the years and had been entirely forgotten. Gautama insisted that this insight was simply a statement of things as they really are. The path was written into the very structure of existence. It was therefore the Dharma par excellence, because it had elucidated the fundamental principles that govern the life of the universe. If men and women, animals and gods kept to this path, they could all attain enlightenment, and that would bring them peace and fulfillment, because they were no longer struggling against their deepest grain. Okay, so here we go. Armstrong continues her difficult hermeneutic balancing act of balancing her audience's kind of preferences. On one side, she's balancing a view of the Buddha as a sort of historical, critical kind of Buddha of history. On the other side, she's balancing the audience of the pluralist, sympathetic, spiritual person and wanting a sort of pluralist idea. So this first statement, if there's any truth to the story, well, that first phrase is very historical, critical. He gained enlightenment at Bodh Gaya in a single night. So this is a difficult hermeneutic balancing act, holding both the historical, critical, skeptical view of the Buddha and the religious, pluralist view of the Buddha as a sort of symbol of some deeper truth that only she has special access to. But finally, could Armstrong actually be taking up a position within a doctrinary debate in Buddhism that is pro-Mahayana and anti-Theravada? Well, the word could there is in capitals for a reason. I love it. It could, hedging her bets, it could be that he acquired a sudden absolute certainty. He had discovered a method that would follow energy, bring the earnest seeker. It could be. It's a very interesting could that she uses there. And the key word we're going to spend just a little bit of time looking at is this word, sudden. A sudden, absolute certainty. Now what she's not kind of explaining here is this huge area of debate within Buddhism. It's an enormous area of debate within Buddhism. I thought I'd just show you where Bodh Gaya is. We've had Bodh Gaya referenced here. Here's the great temple of Bodh Gaya. You can go there today, and you find Bodh Gaya in the north of India, just near Sarnath, and it's one of the 4 places you might go on pilgrimage, as we've talked about before. Now, he really had discovered. Now this, just where did it go? He really had discovered. Now we need to kind of keep going. He really had discovered, and we're going to come back to this word sudden just a second. he really he had acquired absolute certainty. He really had discovered, and this word had, let's go for red. He really had discovered a method. So let's just take this phrase sudden, and it's also the following language, I guess, as well. He had not, on the contrary, he had always insisted he had simply discovered a path of great antiquity and ancient real travel by whom makes a far off distant path. Now, what is going on here with this word sudden, and in what sense could it be that it was a sudden discovery, that he really had this kind of religious experience? Well, this is a big debate I want to just spend a minute looking at, and it's the debate within Buddhism. It's like a theological debate, and it's between two views called suddenism and gradualism. Now, it's more of a debate in Mahayana than Theravada, but it is a debate that predates the Theravada Mahayana schools to the Nikaya period of Buddhism. It's a bit like the theology debate in Christianity, in Christian traditions. That doesn't make a lot of sense to outsiders, but it's very important to the people involved. Think of, for example, should we use a wafer or a chunk of bread? Should we use wine or grape juice? Should we use Latin or the vernacular? Should we use infant or adult baptism? Suddenism versus gradualism was a very important debate in Buddhism. And in the text, we're going to think about this. What is suddenism? Well, gradualism, first of all, you could argue, is perhaps more prevalent in the early period. You go through the jhanas, you practice the jhanas, and you gradually progress through the jhanas in meditation. And this was, if not the original, the older approach in the Pali Canon, that if you follow the dharmas, this teaching, one step at a time, if you engage in this sort of arduous practice, as the Buddha does in the Pali Canons, it's sometimes, he suggests pati, gradual training, anupatsika, because the eightfold path involves a process of mind-body transformation that unfolds. That's a full unfolding, an unfolding over 8 steps, a lengthy period of time. And we get this quote in Udana, in the Pali Canon, in one of the passages, Udana 5.5. Just as the ocean has gradual shelf, a gradual slope, a gradual inclination, with a sudden drop-off after a long stretch, in the same way this discipline of Dharma Vinaya, has a gradual training, anaputsakya, a gradual performance, anaputsakiriya, a gradual progression, anaputsapatida, with a penetration to gnosis only after a long stretch. So there's Thanissaro Bhikkhu's translation of a passage called the in Pali Canon. So the classical accounts in the Pali Canon reflect the Buddha's life. He took 6 years searching for enlightenment. It was only after his period of asceticism and some kind of period of meditation under the Bodhi tree that it suddenly came upon him. The emphasis on gradual training, we could argue, may be understood and was understood as through the idea of habits. Human habits need to be developed. You have to become the kind of person who would become enlightened, built up over a long period of time. Habits take time to and require sustained focus and effort, and are only achievable. These habits are only achievable with genuine commitment and training. So this gradualism that's in the pre-Theravada Mahayana period was continued very much in Theravada. Think about early Theravada thinkers like Buddha Aghosha in his commentaries and philosophy, through to Bhikkhu Bodhi today. Each of these typical of a thorough, patient gradualist, following the teachings of the elders, the practices laid down long ago over long periods of, for example, vipassana. It takes a whole week to go on a vipassana meditation, not just a day, not just a moment. Bhikkhu Bodhi says, don't try and be a dry stream enterer. Don't taking shortcuts around the four jhanas. You have to learn to progress through the four jhanas. So both and Theravada reform movements in the last 2 centuries have likewise emphasized gradualism. The new Burmese technique, or the Thai forest tradition, each emphasize gradualism. Now, it has to be said there are some Theravada references to Suddanism, but these are sparse, and typically Theravada is the gradual way. So does that mean that Mahayana, if Theravada is the gradual way, if Buddha Aghosha and Bhikkhu Bodhi are typical of the thorough, patient gradualists who follow the teaching of the elders over a long period of time, what about Mahayana? Well, the earliest Madhyamaka thinkers like Nagarjuna develop the doctrine of sudden enlightenment over in the early days, in the context of the sort of early polemical writings against the Sravera Nikaya Buddhists of Sri Lanka, of the Mahavihara sect. Today, and they wouldn't have had the luxury of being gradualist. They needed to differentiate themselves. So Suddanism would have been a good way to differentiate themselves. Today, the word for Suddanism is called Subbitism, Subbitism, and it's used to point to sudden awakening. The idea of insight into Buddha nature, or the nature of the mind, is sudden, in one glance, uncovered altogether, together completely simultaneously, in contrast to successively being uncovered one after another. It's the opposite of gradualism. Now, so a southern, what it became known in later years as a southern school of Mahayana Buddhism, emphasized gradualism, but not all Mahayana agreed. Developing elsewhere is this Buddha nature school of Buddhism, which emphasized gradualism. So southern school, Suddanism, Buddha nature school, gradualism. The southern school had an emphasis on enlightenment, and it shifted its teaching from the Lankavara Sutra to using as its doctrinal basis the Prajnaparimitas writings, especially the Diamond Sutra. The Lankavara Sutra became the key sutra in the Buddha nature school, which endorsed Buddha nature, the purity of mind, and all of this being attained through gradations, stages. So this Diamond Sutra emphasizes sunyata. The southern school, which later influenced, ironically, the northern Tibetan, later Chinese developments, the key teaching is emptiness, sunyata, going back to Nagarjuna. And it, in a sense, to quote it, all must be realized totally or not at all. So you realize the whole thing simultaneously or not at all. Everything's either full or it's empty, in other words. Now, when in the 8th century or so Buddhism is beginning to emerge in China, Chan Buddhism adopted gradualism in about the 8th century. And there's a key guy who's very, very influential in this. And his name is Huyan. And Huyan was a monk in the Chinese imperial court. And he's known as the 6th patriarch or 6th ancestor of Chan. And sudden enlightenment became his key teaching, one of the hallmarks of Chan Buddhism. Now, later Chan Buddhists would soften Huyan's emphasis on the doctrine of sudden enlightenment, but it would continue to be as it was transmitted from China then to Korea and then on to Japan. Chan Buddhism would divide into different schools, and while Chaodong Soto Chan Buddhism, one of the 5 houses of Chan, founded by Lingji in 807 to 8, who lived 807 to 869, was a gradualist. Think Zazen, I suppose, taking lots of time to eventually rack up momentary awareness of Buddha nature. Rinzai Zen, founded just a little bit later by Lingji, as opposed to Langji, continued the suddenness doctrine of acquiring Buddha nature. Think of how he would shout and beat his students. Look at this guy shouting and beating his students. And we need to ask a question about all of this. Is Armstrong ignoring yet again Buddhist doctrinary developments and disagreements within Buddhism, even within traditions of Buddhism, within Mahayana, between Southern School and Buddha Nature School, even within Zen, within Rinzai Zen and Soto Zen? Rinzai was continued to be an important influence. Dr. D.T. Suzuki was a seminal influence in this regard. His contention that Zen Saratori, or awakening, was the goal of the tradition's training. Suzuki portrayed Zen Buddhism as a highly practical religion, whose emphasis on direct experience made it particularly comparable to forms of mystical experience, and that such scholars as we've looked at, like William James, had emphasized as the fountainhead of all religious sentiment. So we move on. Armstrong is ignoring doctrinary developments and debates. She goes on to talk about the other Buddhas had predecessors, had taught this path immeasurably long time ago, but this ancient wisdom had faded over the years and entirely been forgotten. It was therefore, Gautama insists this insight was simply a statement of things as they really are. The path was written in the very structure of existence. It was therefore the Dharma par excellence, because it elucidated the fundamental principles governing the life of the universe. Armstrong is ignoring another key debate, that before the Theravada Mahayana, in the Nikaya period, it was believed there were 3 types of Buddhas, or 3 types of yanas, or paths. And we'll look at this in more detail when we look at the next anthology piece. But there was the Stravaka, literally the hearer path. These are people who become Buddhas perhaps because they listen. And this was the way the Mahayana writers would later think about Theravada. There was the Prakya Buddhas, who achieved full Buddhahood through their own insight, but didn't communicate it with others. There were, Theravada believed anyone else can discover the teachings of the Buddha, like natural laws, but it takes someone special to communicate it. And then there was the Bodhisattva, the one who has the resolve to bring all beings to enlightenment. Now this is a term Theravada reserve for the Buddha and perhaps at most kings of Sri Lanka. However, Mahayana say any one of us can be a Bodhisattva. Any one of us can bring others to enlighten. But we'll look at this in more detail in Basham's second anthology piece, when he develops the doctrine of the Bodhisattva and how it evolves, develops within emerging Mahayana teaching in Buddhism from its Theravada background. Now, going back to this phrase, other Buddhas, there were other Buddhas, his predecessors, who taught this path an immeasurably long time ago. Now, what on earth is she going on about here? And again, is she hiding vague conspiracy? If there are Stravaka Buddhas, if there are Prakya Buddhas, and if there are Bodhisattvas, what is this controversy all about? Well, in the Pali Canon, there's an example of this. Dipankara, which means lamper, was one of the Buddhists in the Jakarta tales of the past. And here again, it's said that he would live on Earth 100,000 eons ago. According to Buddhist traditions, Dipakana was a Buddha who reached enlightenment eons prior to the Gautama historical Buddha. Now, what's going on here? Both Theravada and Mahayana have epistemic certainty about the result of, their methods will result in true knowledge of what they consider to be the best teaching, whether it's Mahayana or Theravada teaching. And we could go through those. So we come back to this notion of certainty, that absolute certainty. He acquired sudden and absolute certainty. Well, Theravada are certain, Mahayana are certain. The only person who isn't certain, it seems, is Armstrong. But she's certain, if anything, that neither Mahayana or Theravada are right, but that her privileged pluralistic perspective is the right perspective. Anyway, what's going on? Theravada and Mahayana are doing different things here. Theravada, when they read the Pali Canon, actually deflate, minimize accounts like this one of the past Buddhas. They don't talk about it much. Not only is there past Buddhas, but there are future Buddhas, and Mahayana would like to talk about this. Not only future Buddhas, but Maitreya as the Buddha to come back again in the sort of apocalypse, as it were, the Buddha of the future. So what's going on? Theravada and Mahayana have certainty in their teachers. They hold contrary views about the origins of life and everything, of salvation, of the proper goals of Buddhism. And Armstrong is not mentioning any of these controversies in her homogeneous, generic, secular Buddhist, secular pluralist Buddha. So we read on. If men and women, animals and gods kept this path, they could all attain enlightenment, and that would bring them peace and fulfillment. And it's worth pausing here and saying Mahayana wouldn't be so persuaded that they could all attain enlightenment. This would be a false statement, a dualistic statement on the two and three truth doctrine. But there's something even more important that she says. This path, she talks about this path. They kept to this path. And I want to say, which path? Which path, Armstrong? Whose Dharma? Which teaching is the best path to follow? Is it the Theravada way of the elders, or the perfected wisdom of Mahayana? And not only which path, she goes on, will bring them peace, fulfillment, because they were no longer straying against their deepest grain. Well, what grain? What path? Mahayana believe in Ekyana. That's Ekyana. It's a funny word. E-K-Y-A-N-A. Ekyana, it means one vehicle, one path, one way. Everything, whether we realize it or not, is the same goal, the same path anyway. Theravada don't realize it, but they're really walking the Mahayana path. That's Mahayana teaching, and it's rejected. We'll see this in the third anthology piece by Rahula, who rejects this outright. Theravada claim Mahayana is false, and that their path is not a true path. Again, Armstrong is ignoring these exclusivist debates, given her pluralistic goals. She's suggesting a sort of no specific mashup, mostly of perhaps Theravada views with a bit of Mahayana thrown in, about enlightenment and the proper goals of Buddhism. This phrase, grain, their deepest grain. Well, what is our deepest grain? Is it our problem that comes out of the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, that we are impermanent, anicca, and therefore we suffer, dukkha, and that we are made of parts, anatta, the parts, the skandharas? Or is it the Mahayana grain, that we are empty, and that is our delusion, our dualistic delusion? That is our deepest grain, the struggling against the truth of primordial mind or Buddha nature or emptiness, or that we inter-be, we inter-are with all other beings, as Zen would say, like Thich Nhat Hanh. But no, we have no answers from Armstrong, because she doesn't, in her flat version of the Buddha, introduce us to any of these debates. So that's section 17.